Good evening and welcome. So before we begin, apologies, setting up the really fun technological stuff. So before we dive into introductions, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and honor the original inhabitants of the areas that the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica represents. Leagues at all levels are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion in policy and in practice. And land acknowledgements are a part of our efforts towards becoming a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive organization. Our league represents the areas of Santa Monica and Malibu, which are the traditional lands of three tribal nations, the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh. We recognize that an acknowledgement is only the first step towards working with Native communities to secure meaningful partnership and inclusion in the stewardship and protection of their cultural resources and homelands. And we encourage you to learn more about Native lands. A great resource is native-land.ca, which has maps of tribal nations and other educational resources. So we are very grateful that you're able to join us this evening, especially with so many other things going on tonight. This is the League of Women Voters of Santa Monica's third event of a monthly series discussing the causes, current issues, and potential solutions to our current housing crisis. And tonight's event is a little bit different, but housing has been a major topic of interest for the League, especially in recent history. And as we know, it's a very large topic. So tonight's focus is around something that's been getting a lot of attention lately in Santa Monica, but many of us don't know that much about housing elements. What is a housing element and why does it matter? And how does it actually impact us? And what's the effects? If you've heard the acronym RHNA or RHNA, you may already know that it stands for Regional Housing Needs Assessment, i.e., the process by which the California Department of Housing and Community Development determines and allocates the amount of housing specific regions need to create on an 8-year cycle. As a part of this process, each jurisdiction has to develop a housing element with a plan for how that jurisdiction plans to meet their goal. But there's a lot that goes into those plans. And yes, I know I've said plans like 7 times. They have a very real impact on the futures of our communities. And tonight you'll get to hear from 3 panelists who are very knowledgeable about housing elements and their impacts and housing in general. I will note, unfortunately, one of our panelists, the fourth one, Jing Yao, was not able to make it tonight because of a scheduling conflict. So tonight's panelists in order of presentations are Sean Landris, Paavo Monkanen, and Tara Barauskas. And tonight's moderator is Darlene Evans. Darlene is a longtime resident of Santa Monica, a lawyer and a community participant. She's currently a member of the League of Women Voters, the Santa Monica College General Advisory Board, Santa Monica Travel and Tourism Board, Fame Redevelopment Corporation, and custodial chair of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Westside Coalition. Each of tonight's panelists will make an individual presentation followed by Q&A moderated by Darlene. In order to keep us to time this evening, we will have unfortunately, our timer wasn't able to make it. So I'll be timing our panelists this evening. And once they reach 10 minutes, I'll pop up on the screen just to let them know and allow them to finish their remarks. We've received some audience questions ahead of time, and we welcome you to add your questions via the Q&A feature. And I will note, as there are likely to be many questions, we probably won't be able to get to all of them. But we will have a note that those questions have been asked. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Darlene to introduce our first panelist.
Hello, everybody. Nice to be here and nice to see you. Our first panelist is Sean Landris. He's currently chair of the City of Santa Monica Planning Commission and immediate past chair of the Los Angeles County Quality and Productivity Commission, which oversees the nation's oldest and largest local government innovation fund. He is a senior fellow at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs and co-founder and board co-chair of Jumpstart Labs. Sean holds degrees in religious studies and social anthropology from Columbia University, the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the University of Oxford. He has co-edited 4 books and published award-winning articles and essays that advance intergroup understanding. He has more than 2 decades of experience in academic, nonprofit, and philanthropic leadership, social entrepreneurship, network building, and organizational development. Sean?
Thank you, Natalia and Darlene. It's great to be here. And I will, I'm looking forward to this conversation with everyone, and especially with Tara and Pavo, who really are truly experts in this work. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the basics of the housing element. I want to acknowledge the work of Jing Yo, planning manager at the City of Santa Monica Community Development Department, Planning Division, for her work. And the PowerPoint that I'm about to share is actually is her PowerPoint that is based on the one that was presented to the Planning Commission. I also want to say in the sort of run up to these comments that these are my own comments. I'm not speaking for the city. I'm not speaking for the Planning Commission. And I hope that it will be clear over the next few minutes that I'm doing my very best to focus on the background of the housing element. The Planning Commission will be holding a hearing on the draft housing element next Wednesday, June 2nd at 5:30. We will hear a staff presentation, and we will be taking public comment from as many people as would like to be heard on the evening of June 2nd. We expect that what will happen is that we will then adjourn the meeting and pick it up again on Thursday evening, June 3rd, where the Planning Commission will have a chance to discuss the draft housing element and make recommendations related to it that will be forwarded to the City Council. The City Council will hear the same presentation with our emendations incorporated on June 15th, and then we'll vote on that draft housing element. And again, if this is sort of, we're laying out the game, and I haven't even told you what it is, but from there still have to be a number of other things that will happen before the final housing element will be certified. But this is important now because the bulk of the work is taking place now. And once the housing element is forwarded to the state of California, to the Housing and Community Development Department, then it will come under review. The feedback will come back to us. And in September, we will go through this one more time. We will see the feedback from HCD, Housing and Community Development. We will incorporate our responses to that feedback. And once again, the Planning Commission will then make its recommendations, forward them to the City Council. The City Council will have to approve a final housing element by the end of September. That is the play-by-play. That is the schedule. But you've probably at this point sitting here and saying, that's great, Sean, but what is this housing element of which you speak? So let's go back to the beginning. And I want to make sure that everybody understands that housing element is one of Santa Monica's 8 elements that are part of Santa Monica's general plan. So according to the state law in California, every city has to adopt a general plan. A general plan is a blueprint, and this I'm taking off the draft housing element itself. I'm quoting, blueprint for how a particular city or county will develop. It expresses the community's development goals and embodies public policy relative to the distribution of land uses in the case of the land use and circulation element. But there's also a conservation element. There is an open space element. There's a noise element, a safety element, and those are the 7: land use and circulation, conservation, housing, open space, noise, and safety that are required under state law. And in addition to that, Santa Monica has a historic preservation element. And so we are required to update our housing element according to a timeline that's set by state law. So I just want to, as we get into this, we have a general plan, and then we have all of these different elements, and they interact with one another so that the work we do on the housing element is then going to have knock-on effects on land use and circulation, open space, safety, and other things. And it's a heads up for everyone. So I imagine that sometime in the next few months, there will be a League of Women Voters of Santa Monica panel series on the safety element, because that has not been updated since, I think, 1995. And the state has made quite a lot of changes to that element. So let us now jump into the planning element itself. And hopefully this is going to work. Here we go. Here we go. All right. So this is a little bit of a walkthrough of the housing element. And here we go. Hopefully now, there we go. So what is the housing element? So since 1969, and I'm gonna run through these, and these slides are up on the city's website in a variety of formats. It may not be in this particular format, but this is the slideshow that has been presented in a lot of places. So if you want to go back and see it, I'll have at the very end of the presentation the website where you can go and learn more and probably get access to a bunch of these PowerPoints. So in 1969, the state set up the housing element, and we have to go through it every 8 years. Here's another. So HCD, we talked about housing and community development. If you're writing down your acronyms or you're playing acronym bingo at home, Southern California Association of Governments is going to be an important acronym to bear in mind, called SCAG. It is a metropolitan planning organization that represents 6 counties and 191 cities, including Santa Monica. And we're going to come back to that in a minute. And again, if we don't do the work that the state requires, there could be fines and penalties. So the City Council has directed the Planning Commission and staff to return with a compliant housing element. So that is what we are aiming to do. Next slide coming now. Great. So what goes into a housing element, right? So a housing element is policies and programs, and it's also an assessment of the resources and constraints we have available. So what do we do when we look at a housing element? First thing we do is we look back at the previous one. How do we do? Did it work? Was it effective? Then we look at the housing needs assessment. What are the population trends, the employment trends, the housing characteristics, and special needs that apply to our particular jurisdiction? Do we have the resources to do it? Do we have the land? Do we have the finances? Do we have the administration? And then what are the constraints? What are our existing zoning rules, our land use plans and regulations, fees, procedures? What's the environment? For example, do we have a tsunami zone? Do we have a fault running through our city? What's the infrastructure that's available? What are the costs? And then what are the factors associated with affordable housing? So this is the process that I talked you through briefly. And I want to start with this box at the upper left-hand corner, which seems to have sparked quite a lot of conversation in our city. And this is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Allocation. The thing that I want everyone to remember about this allocation is that it is part of, and a big part of, our housing element, but it is not the only part of our housing element, because a very important part of our housing element is the plans, policies, and plans and programs to affirmatively further fair housing. And there are obligations on our part in our city to make progress in addressing the historic, systemic, structural racism associated with redlining and other practices that took place in Santa Monica that were that were suborned or even advanced by political leadership in Santa Monica that our council has studied. I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague, Commissioner Nina Fresco, who gave a really powerful presentation to the Planning Commission and then a summary of that presentation to the City Council back in March, really laying bare the history of housing and housing redlining in Santa Monica that displaced, that excluded, both excluded and displaced African Americans, Latinos, Jews, Asian Americans, and many, many others. So the RHNA allocation is the count of housing units that we are obliged to be able to say that we can produce. And in addition to that, we are also obliged to figure out what we are going to do to improve and restore and rectify inclusive housing in Santa Monica. And I think I'm very happy to be serving on the Planning Commission, given that the City Council not only directed us to return with a compliant housing element, but also with one that really does address this history in Santa Monica and attempts to make some progress in redressing it. So I've gone over this. The only thing that you really haven't heard me talk about is another acronym. This really is like turning into a drinking game here. The Environmental Impact Report, or EIR. Every time we do a housing element or a land use and circulation element, we also have to study the prospective environmental impact of our plans. And that serves as a kind of working envelope for what we can do. And since the previous environmental impact reports that were conducted don't quite cover the level of housing that we are going to be asked to plan for, we have to do a number of additional EIRs. So I'm going to keep moving through this. I want to point out here that our RHNA allocation, that's what I'm going to talk about here, is 8,895 units. I'm going to skip through this conversation about the housing crisis. I think previous panels may have addressed it, and I really want to stay focused on the housing element. So here's how this works. The regional housing needs assessment and allocation are the number of housing units that are expected in California for an 8-year cycle. And the first thing that I want to stress is that these allocations, our allocation does not come directly from Sacramento. What Sacramento does is it looks to the regions of the state. Remember that I mentioned that our Southern California Association of Governments, or SCAG, is our metropolitan planning organization. So it has allocated, let me pull this up, more than 1.3 million units. And you can see there on the lower left-hand corner, the area that SCAG covers. So within those 1.3 million units, Santa Monica has been assigned nearly 8,900 units, okay? And so essentially those 1.3 million units have to be found somewhere. And then the discussion is on what basis would Santa Monica be allocated 8,900 units? And this is how we get there. So as adopted by SCAG, and I'm really like, as I'm listening to myself speak with Pavo speaking next, he is the expert on this. And so no doubt he will correct everything I'm about to say, but I do want to explain it so people understand where we're coming from. There is household growth in California, notwithstanding our census that showed that California's population as a share of the United States is a slightly lower proportion. There still is household growth in California, and there is in particular household growth in Southern California, right? And then there's a need for there's a need for vacancies, because you need to have vacancies in a market in order to keep that market somewhat fluid and competitive for both buyers and sellers and renters and landlords and all the kinds of people who are engaging with one another in a population. And then, of course, housing has to be replaced. Not all, nothing lasts forever. So you look at the housing need, then you look at the existing housing need. You look at where do people live? Where are the jobs, right? And where are the cities and the areas of the Southern California area and of LA County that have the resources to sustain this housing growth? So that gets you the total housing need. Then, as you can see on the right side, there is an adjustment that looks to address disproportionality across the region and across the county. We have an obligation to think about how we affirmatively further fair housing, and then we get the units allocated into income categories, and this is where we this is where we are going to land. So let's look back first before we look forward. And what you can see is that Santa Monica has done very, 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 well relative to the RHNA when it comes to market rate, above moderate rate units. Those are units that are placed into circulation and are available on the market for anybody to buy and sell. Here comes another acronym, AMI. So every county has an area median income that is calculated for the county. In Los Angeles, we have an area median income that is set for a family of 4, but that AMI can change if you're a family of 1 or if you're a family of 9. Those are going to change depending on who's in your family. And so what we look at is our obligation to produce affordable housing. And affordable housing is calculated as housing that is affordable to people who make a percentage of the area median income. So let's take as a ballpark, I don't have the number in front of me, roughly for a family of 4, the area median income is around $70,000 plus or minus. And so that means if you are in the extremely low category, your family income, if you're a household of 4, is 30% of 70,000. Then you're in the extremely low category. If you're in the very low category, it's 50% of 70,000. Low income, 50 to 80%, and then moderate income is 80 to 120. And since we're in Santa Monica, this is the place where I want to mention Proposition R, which by charter requires that 30% of the housing we produce in Santa Monica be affordable to people who are earning less than 100% of the area median income. So to make it even more confusing than it already is, the state defines moderate income as 81 to 120% of the area median income. But here in Santa Monica, another very important metric is the Prop R 100% metric. And you can see, once again, we did, depending on your perspective, very well or really too well when it comes to market rate housing. But when it comes to affordable housing, at least by this metric, we did not produce what was expected. So that's where we are. I am at 15 minutes, and so now I need to show you what our RHNA allocation is for 2021 to 2029, and you can see that we are expected to produce really a lot more affordable housing. If you look at the RHNA allocation here on the right side of the screen, than above moderate rate housing. So basically just about three times as much. I'm gonna take a little bit more time here just to make sure that we can lay the groundwork. And then what I'd like to do is turn it over to our next panelists, and we can come back in Q&A. But it's important for us to recognize that not all housing units count toward the RHNA. And it's important for us to understand that if we don't do what the state is asking us to do, then there will be penalties and fines associated with failure to do this work. We could lose grant money, and ultimately we could lose the ability to control what happens on our own land. If we really fail to comply or deliver, we could end up in a situation where any developer could come into any parcel in the city with a compliant project, and they'd get to build it, and wouldn't be anything we can do about it. So it's really in the city's interest to submit a compliant housing element update. I'm going to skip over this part about the housing crisis. What I'd really like to do is just conclude by giving you a preview of what you're going to see when you log into the Housing Commission, the Planning Commission's meeting on June 2nd. So what we have to do is we have to come up with the RHNA, and we have to also come up with the policies and program ideas for how we're going to get there. One key piece of that, get ready for another acronym, is the suitable sites inventory. Now, the suitable sites inventory is literally the city's inventory of property that has residential development potential. And it's not enough just to say, oh, look, there's a parking lot, we could build housing on it. It's not that simple, because that parking lot may not, in fact, have residential development potential if it's not zoned for housing, or if the income from the parking is actually so great that when you go to the owner and say, hey, would you be willing to put housing? The owner's like, yeah, no, because I'm happy cutting a check every month. So cashing a check every month. So the state actually requires us to do research, and staff has been doing research to see which sites actually could be used for housing, and then what it would take to get those sites to produce more the housing that we need at the income rates that we need. So next week, what you're going to see, and I'm going fairly quickly through these slides, what you're going to see is we're going to hear a presentation on the housing element. We're going to hear a presentation on the policies that we ought to consider based on, and it's sort of a chicken and egg crisis, right? So the chicken and egg crisis is we only have so many sites. So we have to know what's available. Then we have to think about what are the policies that we need to produce in order to make those sites really productive in terms of housing potential. And then once we've written the policies, we have to go back and check to make sure that those sites are actually going to do the thing that we want them to do. So it's this constant back and forth between the policies and the sites, and the programs in the middle are the things that turn the policies into the sites. Now, the last thing that I want to say before I put up the slide here is one piece of the housing element that we have not talked about that is absolutely crucial to our housing element is stability and preservation. It is how do we keep people in their homes who are there, who are facing rent increases, who are on fixed incomes, who are facing Ellis Act evictions. We've not talked about the potential after COVID for a wave of Ellis Act evictions, and that's something we need to be really worrying about. And a huge part of our housing element that we really want to make sure is addressed, I've talked about the technical side, is also the plans and programs for keeping people in their home. These are programs like Preserving Our Diversity, which is a housing subsidy for elderly residents, and other programs that help tenants stay in their buildings. So with that, I'm going to show you this website one more time. Here is the website. It's also in the chat. You can go here to download your very own copy of the housing element, and hopefully we'll see all of you in the queue to give thoughtful public comment or not thoughtful. We want to hear from you no matter what. That's your right. And I will die on that hill to make sure you get to give your comments June 2nd at the Planning Commission. So with that, look forward to hearing and learning from everyone else. Thanks. Let me stop my share and turning it over to Darlene.
Thank you so much, Sean. That was terrific explanation, really helpful. Our next speaker is Paavo Monkkonen. He's an associate professor of urban planning and public policy at the UCLA Luskin School of Public Affairs. He is also director of the Latin American Cities Initiative, the coordinator of the Regional and International Development Concentration, and a faculty cluster leader for the Global Public Affairs Initiative. Paavo researches and writes on the ways policies and markets shape urbanization and social segregation in cities around the world. His scholarship ranges from studies of large-scale national housing finance programs to local land use regulations and property rights institutions, often not recognized for their importance to housing. His past and ongoing comparative research on socioeconomic segregation and land markets spans multiple countries, including Argentina, Brazil, China, Hong Kong, India, Indonesia, and the United States. Pavel continues to work as a consultant on national housing and urban policy in Mexico, where he has various long-term research projects. Pavel?
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's really great to be here. Good to see everybody. Happy to talk about housing elements. My bio seems more international than I have been recently. Actually, my projects in Mexico right now are in fact parallel to what's happening in California with this idea of planning meta regulation. So like how states or federal governments supervise local planning practices. But we're talking about California housing elements today, and I'm happy to talk about Santa Monica specifically. I grew up in Culver City, and so I've been to Santa Monica many times. And I have a couple of things I wanted to highlight that I think would be interesting and important to know about the housing element update process. I'm gonna time myself just to make sure that once I get started talking about housing elements, I may never stop. So I think Sean laid out very well kind of the large state machinery that ends up giving a city a target in terms of planning for future growth in California. And then the housing element itself actually has 4 components. It used to have 4, and now it's going to have a 5th component with the AFFH section. So I'll just briefly mention what those are, and then I'll highlight kind of what has changed. I think it's really important to understand this time is very different. So we've been doing this process for 50 years in the state. It hasn't really had much of an impact on cities before. Right now, I think we're at a really pivotal moment in the state's history where it could have a large impact on housing development and cities. We'll see whether that happens, right? So it depends in part on whether cities are actively following the law, the spirit of the law, and whether the state government holds cities accountable to what they're supposed to be doing. So the four parts of it are a needs assessment. So basically the city should survey its residents, consider housing needs. They should think about constraints to housing development. So what are the factors, both governmental constraints like minimum lot sizes or density restrictions, and the non-governmental constraints like tsunami risk or something, right? Then the sticky point, the kind of maybe the biggest topic of contention this time especially is the sites inventory, right? And this is the part of the element where this city has to demonstrate to the state that they have space to grow to the level that the state through the regional government has asked them to grow. And then there is the programs component. So I think Sean mentioned the importance of this programs component, right? So this is a really big opportunity for advocates and community members and the city itself to advance improve ongoing programs around housing or create new programs around housing, right? I think, especially when we start thinking about how to do fair housing better or differently, there will be new programs needed. If we think about, maintaining rent control programs as part of the housing element or expanding them, et cetera, that can definitely be a program in the housing element. The new component is the affirmatively furthering fair housing component, right? So this was spurred by another meta regulation, right? The Fair Housing Act of 1968 had an element in it that asked cities to affirmatively further fair housing. Unfortunately, like California's housing element process, that part of the fair housing law was never really successfully implemented. Obama started to do something around it, but not to the level that needs to be done if it's to realize its goals, right? So the goal of the affirmatively fair housing, spirit of affirmatively furthering fair housing is to reverse the legacy of segregation in this country. And that's going to be very hard, right? If you start looking at the data, and I'll show actually a map of Santa Monica in a little bit, we have a really entrenched inequality in our land use regulation, right? So single family zoning in this country really separates people with higher incomes from people with lower incomes, owners from renters. I think it's exciting at this moment that there is a real opportunity to change that. I think it's a historic time for people that work on housing. Across the country, we are seeing cities start dealing with this legacy and start realizing that if they are going to affirmatively further fair housing, they can't continue to prevent apartments from being built in their richest neighborhoods, right? And so that's, I think, a topic that Santa Monica has taken on, and I'm excited about that. So, one other advantage of the housing element process, I think, this 8-year period, something that I've studied in other countries' planning processes as well, requiring a city every 8 years to update their one element of their general plan is really important. As Sean mentioned, many other elements don't get updated for 20, 30 years, but that's not, times change, new things need to happen. So this citywide conversation happening every 8 years, I think, is really important and different from the way we do a lot of planning, which is thinking about one parcel and should this parcel change and how should this particular building look. This conversation has to be a citywide conversation. We have to start thinking about, well, if we want to advance fair housing goals, what do we need to do as a city? So the sites inventory that Sean mentioned, I'll talk maybe a little bit about how that actually happens in practice. Basically, the city gets a target of low-income housing units that it is expected to allow to be produced, right? So one reason that the housing element process, I said, has never really had a big impact in the state of California is that it has usually been a kind of paper exercise where cities had to show the state that they had enough space to potentially allow some housing to be built. Often the number that they had to allow for was quite low, and the state didn't really rigorously scrutinize those plans, right? Because there's a lot of cities, it would be hard for them to rigorously scrutinize those plans. But as a result, cities could demonstrate that they had theoretical zoning space for housing to be built, but not actually have that housing be built, right? And now it is different. Now there is an expectation that that housing be built. And so one important way to make that happen, as Sean mentioned, worrying about whether a specific parcel is actually going to be developed in the next 8 years, right? That's a tough nut to crack, right? Talking to the landowner, do you think you're going to develop this? Talking to developers, is this a developable parcel at its current zoning? Like, how could we get this developed? Like, this is a complicated thing to figure out. And I think one important way that the state is asking cities to do it differently this time is to consider the likelihood of development overall. And so what I mean by the likelihood of development is thinking about, well, if we want to build 1,000 housing units, how much space do we need? If we have only 1,000 units of space, we have to be sure that every single one of those parcels will be developed at the capacity that we expect it to be developed, right? I teach at a university, and the way we think about admissions at a university is, if we want 1,000 students to come into our university, we're going to admit 3,000 students, because we know from past experience the take rate is something like 1/3, right? So if we admit 3, one of them will attend. And so I think that's the way that cities really have to start thinking about the sites inventory if they are going to actually achieve the production targets that they're being given, right? So if Santa Monica needs to build 8,000 housing units over the last 8 years, if they had a capacity of X, of some amount, and they built 30% of that capacity, then projecting forward, if you want to build 8,000 units, you're going to really need to have zoning capacity for 3 times that, right? And so this is a big change for cities that have been able to just pretend that they were going to get these things developed over the next time period, and zone for the bare minimum, often on parcels that weren't likely to be developed, and have their housing elements certified. This time, the state is going to scrutinize housing elements much more rigorously, and local advocates are going to play a much bigger role in holding cities accountable. So in conversations with HCD, I've heard that, and with other kind of planners around the state, I've heard that, in the last time that housing elements were updated, there was not the kind of housing advocacy we see today in the state of California. Nobody was looking through cities' sites inventories and questioning whether those sites would be developed. And HCD, as I mentioned, didn't have the capacity often to do that themselves. And nowadays you see a lot of people out there looking through proposed sites in housing elements, questioning whether they're viable, questioning whether they meet the letter of the law. for their various uses, and bringing that to HCD's attention, and HCD will be not accepting those sites, right? So it's going to be a very different situation this time. One thing about the low-income housing sites in particular, we have a way to do it, right? That is inadequate. I think in the state of California, you know, we have inadequately funded social housing. We have inadequately funded public housing in this state. You know, if you look at the RHNA targets for the state, right, we're estimating the need for subsidized housing to be something, I don't have the number in front of me, but several times larger than the amount of funding that's available through low-income housing tax credit programs, right? So the principal source of funding for subsidized housing in the state is vastly insufficient to the need that we have, right? And I think it's important to recognize that fact. I think it's important for cities to take the lead and start creating new funding sources for affordable housing as part of their programs section of the housing element. But just because there's not enough funding currently doesn't mean cities shouldn't be zoning for space, making space for subsidized housing, right? And so the way the state of California law, it's 10 minutes, I'm almost there, I'm going to show you the map in a second. The way the state law requires cities to demonstrate that a site is eligible for low-income housing is based on the standard practice around affordable housing production, which is it needs to be a bigger than a half an acre site, and it needs to be zoned for 30 dwelling units per acre. So it needs to be at a certain level of density, and it needs to be of a certain size for it to be eligible to be considered as a low-income site. And so when we start thinking about affirmatively furthering fair housing, it's important to think about where a city's sites for low-income housing are located, right? So affirmatively furthering fair housing has a number of different components. It also asks cities to do an analysis of areas of concentrated poverty, do an analysis if they're a predominantly high-income city. This idea of concentration of affluence is also very important, especially for smaller cities, right? If they're a concentratedly affluent city, they need to make plans and programs to reduce that concentration of affluence in their city, allow different types of people to move into that city. But in terms of the site inventory, one important thing to look at, and something that I've been working on a way to measure, is where are the city's sites for low-income housing, and are they in the lower income or the higher income neighborhoods of the city? Because at a basic level, if historically we've only allowed higher density or affordable housing to be built in low-income neighborhoods, then the only way to reverse that legacy is to allow affordable housing or higher income housing to be built in high-income neighborhoods. And so we can look at a city's plan for low-income housing production and see where they're locating it. And if it's not in the higher income neighborhoods, that plan will not affirmatively further fair housing. And it presents a real challenge, as I said before, because most of the high income people live in single family houses. And so figuring out a model is a challenge, a model for building affordable housing in low density neighborhoods, I think is a real challenge for the state and for the country. So just really quick, share this map of Santa Monica with you. And if you have questions, please interrupt me. I can't see the chat right now. Yeah, so we're developed a way to measure how much affordable housing plans distribute low-income housing sites, right? Sites for affordable housing by neighborhood. And so this is a map of Santa Monica's neighborhoods divided up by incomes. And these are the red dots are hypothetical distributions of sites where low-income housing can be built, right? And we see in Plan A, most of those red dots are in the lower income neighborhoods. And in Plan B, most of those red dots are in the higher income neighborhoods. So Plan B is the one that would actively move to reverse the legacy of segregation. Plan A would really be status quo, entrenching the patterns, the spatial patterns of incomes where they are. And this is a way we represent it kind of graphically, just dividing up the city into its lower income neighborhoods, middle income neighborhoods, and high income neighborhoods, and looking at where the sites for low income housing are located. So this is the 5th cycle sites inventory real data from the city of Santa Monica. right? So we can see that the last time Santa Monica created an inventory where they're designating certain sites as eligible for low-income housing production, it's predominantly in the lower income neighborhoods of the city. And so I think this is going to be a real challenge. I don't think, and because the higher income neighborhoods, as I mentioned, are principally single family neighborhoods, I don't think it's going to be possible for most cities in the state to actually affirmatively further fair housing without figuring out a way to have affordable housing production in their higher income neighborhoods. It's a big challenge. So with that, I'll conclude. I'm happy to talk about any of these topics in the Q&A, but yeah, I think I covered everything I set out to, but I'm happy to respond and look forward to hearing from Tara.
Thank you, Paavo. It was a great presentation, very much appreciated. Our last panelist is Tara Borascos. Tara is the Executive Director of Community Corporation of Santa Monica, which is a nonprofit affordable housing organization based in Santa Monica. Being in this role since 2016, she oversees the functional areas of the organization, including management of 1,600 units of affordable housing, actually that's 1,800, housing development, resident services, maintenance, and administration of 80 staff. Tara has over 20 years of experience in affordable housing development, having worked at both for-profit and nonprofit affordable housing development organizations prior to joining Community Corporation. Her past experience includes overseeing and managing the development process of numerous projects throughout California. She holds a bachelor's degree in English from California State Long Beach and a LEED AP accreditation from the U.S. Green Building Council. She currently serves as vice chair of the board of directors for the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing, which advocates for effective affordable housing policy throughout Southern California. In addition, she serves on the board of the Santa Monica Bay Area Human Relations Council and the board of Downtown Santa Monica, Inc. Thank you for you, Tara.
Great, thanks, Darlene, and hi, everyone. It's great to be here. And I'm going to be speaking today about the back end of the housing element, which is, what are we trying to do with the housing element? We're planning for affordable housing production. So I'm going to be speaking to you about the final product, which is the affordable housing. So I'm going to share my screen. And I wanted to start out just by telling you a little bit about Community Corp for those who aren't familiar with us, and show you a little bit about the affordable housing that we build. So we are a nonprofit that was established in 1982 by community leaders who were concerned about gentrification happening in Santa Monica. And our specific mission is improving lives in neighborhoods by providing high quality, affordable housing for people of modest means. And as was mentioned, we have currently over 1,800 apartments in Santa Monica, about 100 buildings, and we're serving over 4,000 people. And you can see more about us on our website at communitycorp.org, and you'll see photos of our buildings and learn more about what we do. So Paavo had shared a map with you, and this is one specifically of where all of our buildings are in Santa Monica. And this starts to get at what does a housing element do in terms of the way it shapes where buildings are situated. Now, I should be clear that just because a site is identified in the housing element as something that could be developed doesn't mean it necessarily will be. And I'll explain a little bit more about how we actually use the housing element and how we decide where our projects are developed. To show you just a few photos of our buildings, I sort of grouped them into categories in terms of foundational principles that we're concerned about. One is environmental sustainability, both in terms of making sure that we're doing our part for climate change and for the planet, but also for our residents to live in healthy environments. So here you'll see some photos of our buildings that feature passive air and light strategies, so that they are pleasant environments and also low impact in terms of consumption of energy. We also have our building at 5th and Colorado in the top right corner, which was a groundbreaking building when it was built close to 20 years ago, I think it was. And it was one of the first LEED Gold buildings in the country and featured this innovative solar panel model with the vertical solar panels. We also function a lot on things like drought tolerant landscaping and gardens. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we progress. The other element that we focus on is walkable neighborhoods. And again, this gets to where buildings are situated and why they matter. So, we believe that affordable housing should be in every neighborhood, and it should be in neighborhoods near schools, near jobs, near high quality transit, near parks, basically any place that you would be able to get to the place you need to go easily and not always have to be depending on your car. And that's one of the beautiful things about working in Santa Monica is there really is that opportunity to not be so dependent on a car. You can bike, you can take the Expo line, you can now take a scooter. So walkability and being in neighborhoods is very important to us. And, all of our buildings are in neighborhoods with all kinds of different buildings. And we also focus on uplifting environments. And this really just is one of our core principles in terms of making sure that, people feel uplifted where they live. So, we're not just providing four walls and a roof, but we're providing a high quality environment that makes people feel good and empowered. So, these are just some photos of how we use light and natural air and things like that just to create those high quality, healthy environments. And community connection really is at the core of what we do, because we want our residents not only to live in housing that is economically sustainable, but to be able to connect with the community, not only just the neighbors in their building so they can create their own community in the building, but also to feel part of Santa Monica and to connect and be civically active. We have a resident council that participates in various different ways in the community, including on boards and commissions, but also just enjoying nature. So we do a lot of different programs, gardening, we do beach cleanups, hikes, we have after school programs to help kids with academic achievement. Basically, whatever the needs of the community are, we try to help bridge those gaps. So, going to why the housing element matters. Well, it is a planning tool. It's not necessarily a production tool, but planning is integral to what we do. So when you have good policies, when you have well thought out policies, those lay the foundation for being able to then create affordable housing in the manner that we want to do it, which I've just described to you. So, when we, for example, talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, which Pablo just mentioned, being in all those different neighborhoods and making sure that neighborhoods feel inclusive and welcoming and integrated is something that is a direct result of how the suitable sites inventory is selected. And as I mentioned before, the locations near transit is very important. In Santa Monica, we're very fortunate that most everything is near the Expo line, but not only that, it's also near bus. And so I think, the high quality transit piece is great because especially for lower income communities, not having to have a car or, maybe only have one car, it really reduces expenses and leaves expenses for other things. So, really what we're getting at with the housing element is that we're trying to plan for the kind of community we want to see. And then as far as, how that translates into our work, we do participate in the housing element process in terms of helping inform. So we want to help the people who are creating the housing element understand, some of the logistics, and it starts getting specific with regards to zoning and planning and land use elements and criteria. So for example, there's a lot of talk in Santa Monica about density and where should the denser housing be? Should it be on the boulevards? Should it be near transit? Should it be in neighborhoods? Should it be everywhere? And, from our perspective, I'll just say that, density does help in terms of creating more cost efficient housing. And that's certainly extremely important. And I saw a question in the chat earlier about, what is the nexus between the housing element and production in terms of funding the affordable housing? And I will say, the housing element doesn't address the funding aspect of it, but when you can do things like optimize the land use aspect of building affordable housing, it will help with the overall funding of the project. Because what we found is when you can try to find what I call the sweet spot of how many units you can fit on a site, and you have, fixed costs, and there's some fixed costs such as land, for example, like you'll pay, say, $10 million for a piece of land, and you can put 2 units on it or 20 units on it or 50 units on it. So you can immediately see that being efficient with what you can build on the property will help. Now it gets to the point where it's not efficient, and certainly none of our buildings are over 6 stories. So we do focus on trying to make sure we find a building product that is going to be cost efficient to build, that fits with the character and scale of the neighborhood, but maximizes the efficiency of what we can build there. So, we have been participating in the 2 working groups for the 6th cycle housing element, trying to help people understand what those sweet spots are, what the opportunities are in terms of things that would help optimize affordable housing production, reduce setbacks, any other elements in terms of parking. Parking's a big issue. And so we've provided our expertise in terms of what we see in our buildings, and we've been operating them for almost 40 years. So we do have a good sense of what's needed in our community and where some of the requirements could be more flexible to maximize affordable housing production. And as Sean mentioned, the housing element actually encompasses all housing, so affordable and market rate. And, there are different categories and different needs that the city needs to meet. We focus on the 30 to the 80% area median income housing, which, is the more challenging housing to build in a what I'll call a high opportunity neighborhood, which also equals high cost area, right? Everything is expensive in Santa Monica, as you all know. And, affordable housing doesn't really get any breaks in terms of, architects are not really willing, to necessarily give a lot of discounts. They have their own staff they need to pay. And all the building materials certainly are on the open marketplace. And there are no really discounts available in any sector of building affordable housing. So, sometimes people question, why are the costs so high? And that's a lot of it. And also we have, certain policy objectives that we need to achieve in terms of, the funding that we use, which is primarily government funding. So for example, we pay higher wages to the construction workers, and that's a public policy decision that's been made for many years by government funding sources that produce affordable housing. So I just want to be clear that, we sort of have a different set of circumstances we're looking at versus the market rate housing, which is also in, part of the housing element. So in terms of opportunities, I would just say, going to maximizing, if the people who are planning the housing element can take into account how to maximize affordable housing, that will really help with this upcoming RHNA cycle in particular, because there is a large requirement that we need to meet. And the intent of the housing element is not only to, put sites on the map, but got it, Natalia, put sites on the map, but also to actually try to produce the housing. And so, one of the best ways to do that is to try to figure out how to do that. And so certainly, like I said, maximizing efficiency is really important. I think personally, putting housing everywhere is important in every neighborhood as well. And that offers more opportunities for more sites. The challenges are the funding. That's the primary challenge that we have, is that building affordable housing takes sound land use policy, which is really the goal of the housing element, but it also takes funding. So that is, certainly one of the challenges that we're facing, is trying to figure out how to put together more projects in light of the current funding environment. So I think I'll stop there. I know my time's basically up, and happy to participate in the discussion that's going to be happening now. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Tara. That was very helpful and understandable from the developer perspective. So now we're going to start the Q&A portion of our presentation. And we have some questions as we discuss that were presented to us before the event from the community. So I'm going to start with who makes the decisions about how much housing each jurisdiction has to build? And how was that determined for Santa Monica? Anybody can take it, but if not, I will allocate that question to you, Sean.
Well, I was going to punt to Pavo
Okay, I'll punt to Pablo.
because he's actually an expert in this.
I feel
Okay.
like Sean covered it. You covered it pretty well. I'll try to summarize it very briefly. Like until, as I mentioned, there were a number of changes in 2017 overall for the housing element, the law in the state, right? And so one of the changes was exactly how cities were, what the kind of big number that the region needed to zone for was, and then how cities were allocated that number. You know, one of the reasons, as I mentioned, that this process didn't really have a big impact on our cities in this state until this time was that traditionally in Southern California, cities were basically asked, kind of based on your own zoning and growth projections, how much do you think you will grow over the next 8 years? And then the regional government kind of added all those numbers up together and hoped that it was bigger than the number they were assigned at the regional level. This time there was a bunch of arguments about that because a new state law, actually a Richard Bloom law, required the allocation to cities be done using objective measures based on jobs, housing balance, access to transit, and a couple other things. It was a little unclear about how much of the regional number or how much of a city's number needed to depend on those factors. But ultimately, it was the methodology was a combination of some objective measures like jobs, access, transit, et cetera, and then also cities' own projections of growth. So it was a combination of factors.
Darlene, can I ask a follow-up question that a lot of people I think are asking
Go
while
ahead.
we have Pavo? So I think a number of people understand that logic, but also feel that the numbers that were assigned across the region were based on the numbers pre-COVID. And so do you know of any opportunity that Santa Monica or any other city would have to essentially run the same formula, but yield a different set of numbers further on in the housing cycle when we know whether those jobs have all come back? Because, you know, the conversation in Santa Monica is, well, are we looking at 5, 10, 15% commercial vacancy as people move to work from home? And obviously the jury's out, but is there any opportunity for cities to recalculate those figures?
I'm not a lawyer, but I don't think so. You know, things are always changing. The last cycle's numbers were calculated in a recession. I mean, you know, these things are never perfect, so I don't think that that's going to happen.
That was going to be a question that I was going to go to next, but I wanted to add to it the fact that the numbers are different in terms of the population growth, but also the economics of it, because particularly for Santa Monica, I mean, it's been devastated financially as a tourist town, and tourism was just gone for the past year and a half. So where are they looking at, okay, 8,000, close to 9,000 units, where's the money going to come from? Is that a concern at all for anybody?
I mean, it is a concern in terms of low-income housing, but that's the same concern that has always been there. I think also, just to put it in perspective, the allocations that were made this time to cities were better, in my perspective, than previous ones, because cities were not essentially choosing their own number. But they still are vastly disproportionately giving higher numbers to lower income cities, cities far from jobs, cities with a lot of vacant land. I mean, there's a bunch of, like, the gateway cities are getting huge numbers. And I mean, if you think Santa Monica is having a hard time, you know, Bell and Cudahy and these other places that are already super high density don't have a big job space. I mean, they've been given really big numbers too. So if you look regionally, I think Santa Monica's numbers bigger than it ever was, but I don't think if you look regionally and compare it to other cities in terms of job space and other factors, I don't think it's unfair at all. I think it's unfair. it's unfair in the low direction still.
That's actually good to hear from you, because when all you can see is Santa Monica, which is
Yeah.
pretty much all we can see, it seems like a horrendous burden, and
Yeah.
it probably is. But if you're saying that even lower income cities are worse
Yeah.
off than we are, then I suppose, we've got to sort of suck it up. But it is a hard pill to swallow.
Yeah, and Darlene, if I could just add to
Please.
that, I think one of the opportunities that the city does have is to look at city-owned land or other agency-owned land in terms of trying to meet the RHNA objectives. So that's certainly a resource that is available. I know one other resource that maybe is less popular is working, through the inclusionary AHPP program. So leveraging private capital in order to produce affordable housing. And that's a program that's been working pretty successfully here in Santa Monica. So, I think we have a few different tools, but, certainly I think if we want to even attempt to meet the affordable housing objective, we're going to have to be more flexible in terms of the requirements so that we can meet the objectives.
Is it your sense, and I'm glad you brought that up, Tara, that the inclusionary portion would produce enough affordable units? Are there enough developers out there that really want to purchase land here and put affordable units, particularly low-income units, in Santa Monica? If they get the right incentives, are there a lot of them out there?
I wouldn't say that we should rely solely on the AHPP program. I think we're going to need a yes and approach, or we're going to have to try everything to try to get there.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just want to make sure that folks are aware. So again, I hope you will go to the website and you will download our public draft. But if you go to page numbers 57 and 58, you will see that the staff has made a list of the types of sites that would be sort of eligible for inclusion in our suitable sites inventory. And then if you go down on page 58, you'll actually see their estimates. So for folks who are curious, for example, Tara just mentioned the city-owned sites, and the staff's current draft estimates that city-owned sites have the potential, I'm just reading from the page 58, city-owned sites have the potential for accommodating 2,590 units, right? Now, that is not, we have to produce something like north of 6,000, right? We have to produce close to 6,900 affordable units, but more than a third of that number could be accommodated based on staff analysis on city-owned sites.
And for the most part, that's parking lots, right?
It is, this includes 4th and Arizona, Bergamot Arts Center, and Main Street parking lots.
Yeah, okay.
And so there are a lot of opinions. I mean, again, there are a lot of opinions about each of those sites, and there are issues that have to be addressed with each of those sites. But that's the staff estimate.
Okay. Please comment on immediacy and prospects of state legislation and its local impacts. Do you know of any state legislation that hasn't already impacted us, that's coming down the pike that might change things? Yeah, Tara.
I was going to just talk about one that has already passed that has really positively impacted our work, which is AB 1763. That, along with SB 35, are two streamlining bills that were passed statewide that do allow some more incentives for affordable housing. And we directly used one of them at our Las Flores property on 14th Street. So, AB 1763 allows up to 3 additional floors for affordable housing and no parking. Now, just because an incentive allows something, we don't always choose to take all of them, but we do take the ones that make sense and that will bring the cost down. So, I just wanted to share that there are already some great tools in place. Santa Monica already has a lot of great policies as well. In terms of the upcoming session, a lot of the affordable housing bills haven't made it through yet, so we're still working our way through the process. I know there are a couple of bills that are not specific to affordable housing production, but are generally about other types of production. So I don't know if anyone else wants to speak about that.
Anybody? Okay.
No, Pavo, it looks like Pavo did, and I was gonna say
I
something.
mean, Tara, SB 10 is still alive?
I actually haven't checked recently on that
I
one.
think it's I mean, so
SB 9 and 10, yeah.
yeah, there are two bills. So SB 9 would allow allow lots to be split, single family lots to be split, require cities to allow into two, and for each of those to have 2 units on it, as I understand it. So a total of 4. And I think that, and then SB 10 would allow cities to zone for up to 10 units per lot without CEQA headaches. I think, you know, with just to mention again, the affirmatively furthering fair housing through a model of affordable housing development in low density neighborhoods. I mean, this is something I'd love to hear Tara's thoughts on. This would be a new thing for the country, really, right? I mean, so Portland, Oregon has this thing called the residential infill program, where on single family lots now 4 units can be built, or 6 units can be built if they're affordable. And so trying out, you know, opening up all of the city's single family lots to the potential of having 6 units of affordable housing on them would be, I think, a great way to both affirmatively further fair housing and meet the production targets in terms of low-income housing development. Something like that has never really been done, but I think if a city were to propose that and write that as part of one of its programs, you know, because HCD, the state looks at both the sites and the programs together. So if a city like Santa Monica were to say, we want to try to do this thing that has never been done and build subsidized housing in low density neighborhoods, here's our program to try that. I'm sure the state would accept that, and I think it would have a lot of potential to meet these
So
goals.
I would just draw people's attention. I'm going to put the link in the chat so that people know exactly what I'm talking about. And if it doesn't get visible, then let's see, hopefully, no, there it is, panelists and attendees. All right, so if you look at the agenda for next week's Planning Commission meeting, I want to draw your attention to attachment B, which is an R1 development standards analysis. It's also an R2 development standards analysis. What it is a look at in 2 neighborhoods in Santa Monica, one set of consultants assessment of whether or not it would be economically feasible to develop multi-unit housing in traditionally single-family residential neighborhoods. So again, I'm not taking a view of it. I think we're going to have a good discussion at the Planning Commission, but to what Pavo was just saying, which is what would it look like to make that housing available in neighborhoods where it traditionally has not been available? Our staff has contracted for an analysis of whether or not that would be economically feasible. And I would encourage people to look at looking at that learning. There's been quite a lot of discussion statewide about what it would take to address the high land costs and spread those out across multiple units. And I think it's a conversation we're going to continue to have. I do want to take the opportunity to say that there are some things there's some legislation we need. For example, we need legislation that would credit us with protecting market rate units from essentially loss to the market. That is to say, converting market rate units to deed restricted units ought to count for affordable production. Adaptive reuse is not currently credited with housing production. So there's some speculation that there may be adaptive reuse of commercial properties in Santa Monica over the next cycle. And as I understand it, the conversion of a commercial property to a residential property does not count in the housing element. Although if those units came into use, we would be credited for the housing production. So it's a little bit backwards because we'd like to be able to spec out whether or not we could actually do that. So there's some issues where I think Santa Monica in particular has housing types that are at risk or opportunities before us that current state law does not allow us to fully incorporate into our housing element. And we'd welcome, I think, I certainly speak for myself, but I think there would be great benefit to exploring that legislatively.
Yeah. Do you have any ideas to why the adaptive reuse would not count against the RHNA? Because with COVID and the lack of businesses working in person, it seems like that could be a real boon.
I think it would be a really heavy lift for our staff to be able to persuade HCD that a pre-existing commercial office building is likely to become housing. I think it would fail the feasibility test, and so HCD would be very unlikely. I mean, I think you'd have to have a property owner. You know, think about the ownership structure, right? You have a landowner and you have a property. I think you'd have to have a perfect alignment of people who were swearing up and down that this was their plan for HCD to even begin to look at it, and I doubt they would.
Okay. Thank you.
Is that a fair point, Pava? Do you think that's?
I mean, I'd be happy to talk about that specific point more, but if there are other questions, we could move on.
Okay. Just one more that's just sort of been at the top of conversations in terms of there's all this talk about housing crisis and need for affordable housing and to create housing to get people off the streets of Santa Monica and housing for people who work in Santa Monica to be able to live in Santa Monica. But can you actually restrict the housing to Santa Monica residents or people who work in Santa Monica? The new housing, all this affordable housing, can you restrict it?
I can take that one to start. So the way our housing works is that we employ a preference, and it's actually done through the city, not through us. So you can't just say all the housing is only for people who live and work here. But if there are two applicants that are equal in every other respect, you can prefer the person who lives or works in Santa Monica. So they get a priority in terms of the application pool.
Okay, that's good to know, because it's, you know, if you're going to, you know, have to get rid of the parking, you have to get rid of the arts, you're going to have to get rid of so many things to adapt to all this housing. It's nice to know that at least it would be to help people that are here rather than people we don't even know yet. So that's good to know. One of the other things that a question that came in terms of who's going to pay for all this additional resources that this housing is going to create. So additional water, electricity, who pays for that?
Yeah, I know that question's come up in a lot of different circles. I mean, I think, you know, Santa Monica is all built out, right? So there's already a lot of existing infrastructure in place. A lot of the new construction that's being built is extremely efficient in terms of resources. So it's you know, water efficient, energy efficient. You know, most of the buildings we're building now are zero net energy buildings. So they're not really pulling additional resources. They're self-sustaining. So, you know, that addresses, I think, some of the question in terms of resource consumption.
Okay.
Can I also say, you know, many of the, and this is, let's be kind of candid about what the challenges are, and with the coming risk of an eviction tsunami. And I think I want to name that, right? Because there is a fair amount of property in Santa Monica, residential property, that has not been reassessed for many years. And for the purposes of property taxes, it's still assessed because it's been held for so long. It's still assessed at extremely low levels because of the assessed valuation. So as a reminder to everyone, you know, the minute you go in and redevelop a property, whether it's a parking lot or somewhere else, that property then is going to get reassessed. And so the property taxes that are collected on that property are going to go from here, you know, to here or here. And that money is going to get distributed through the state, back through the county, according to where property tax money goes. It's not a one for one. You're not able to say that this dollar goes from this place to this place. But broadly speaking, much of the expense of the infrastructure upgrades, and let's not kid ourselves, there are infrastructure upgrades, but many of those dollars will be readily available in new property tax revenue. And I think that's important. I think that's important to note. The flip side of that, though, is that the housing element does not actually invite us to look at our any resource limitations that we have. And it's an imperfect system. And if you look at, what people are talking about with donut economics, the idea of, how much is good enough, how much economic growth is the right level, what's that perfect level of kind of balanced economic activity. I think those are conversations that we will be having over the next decade. And there will be appropriate pressures brought to bear to look at how we balance our desire for economic growth with real sustainability challenges facing California. And of course, changes in our population, an aging population, the nature of work will change. So I think there's plenty of time to have those conversations, but the housing element really is an imperfect tool for those conversations.
And so because we're getting close to the end of our time, I want to do a couple of wrap-up questions for everybody, starting with where do we go from here? What's our next steps? How do we move forward from this process? And I'll start with you, Tara.
Well, I think, obviously we want to certify the housing element and send that to the state for them to review and approve. So, just in terms of process, I think that's what's happening next. For us, certainly we are very much in the realm of advocating for additional funding resources. We're also looking at more cost efficient ways to build housing, and we may have some recommendations in terms of, things that we can do there. So that's it from my end.
Okay, Paavo?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the community participation in the housing element process is really important. There's a statewide campaign called fairhousingelements.org that has a lot of resources and also things to look for, especially in terms of cities. Not that Santa Monica would ever do this, but, cities putting forward sites that might not have actual development potential. So that's something to look at, getting involved with that. I just did want to mention, I think, Darlene, you made a great point about, let's say Santa Monica builds as many housing units as it has jobs. That doesn't mean that everybody that works in Santa Monica is going to live in those housing units. I do think it's important, I think sometimes when we live in cities, we forget that cities in the United States are in metropolitan areas in many cases. And, we have this very fragmented metropolitan system compared to the rest of the world. And, Santa Monica is surrounded by LA and Culver City and all these other places, right? And so it is, thinking about ourselves as Santa Monicans or Culver Cityans only, I think is not the path forward, because the person across the street lives in a different city, right? So we're all in this region together. And, so I think cities that have a lot of jobs, and if there's 3 jobs for every household, that's a problem. There's no way that even if everybody that wanted to live near their job did, you're preventing that from happening, right? So from thinking about resource and this donut economics thing, right? At least I feel like a minimum standard should be allowing as many houses to be built as there are jobs in a place, so that people, and if LA doesn't, it's true, if only one city does that in the region, it's going to be a problem, but that's why all the cities need to do that, right? So those are my last thoughts.
Okay, thank you. Sean?
So I'm just going to bring this slide up again, which is literally our next steps. The next steps are it's the Planning Commission meeting on June 2nd. And I want to stress this, I cannot stress this enough. We have a kind of a ridiculous pre-registration requirement that I have a really big problem with, but it is what it is. If you would like to speak to the Planning Commission on June 2nd, you need to go to register your request to speak no later than 2 hours before the meeting, which means by 3:30 on Wednesday, June 2nd. I really want to encourage people to call in, to write to us, to share your views. We take your views seriously. You're going to want to do it all over again for June 15th. And then again, when it comes back later in the summer. But again, we will be meeting June 2nd. Please register before 3:30 on the 2nd. Please call in. Please be patient with us. And please tell us what you think, because we will do better work when we hear from the people to whom we are ultimately accountable. So that's what we got to do now. And I'm going to take the screen share down now. If I can
Okay,
figure
and the
it out.
last roundtable discussion, question is, if you knew now, if when you first started this, you knew everything about housing that you know now, what would you have done differently, if anything? I'll start with you, Sean. We'll go back the reverse direction.
Gosh, I've learned a lot from the process. I think our staff has been working tirelessly in the middle of a pandemic and with very few resources to get it done. I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I feel like there are things that we started to do that maybe I would have hoped that our streamlining ordinances that we did a couple of years ago in Santa Monica would have been made permanent from the get-go, so that we could really lean on them in this housing element rather than sort of promise HCD, oh, we promise to extend these. That's a very technical response, but that's where I land. Because I think we've done the best we can with the resources that we have. And we've also, one thing I'm very proud of with the Planning Commission that has done, so we've had an agenda item at every meeting since November, where members of the public could let us know what they're thinking and commissioners could let us know what they're thinking and let staff know what they're thinking. And so I'm hopeful that we've had a robust process. Ask me in October when the thing goes, finally to the state, and then I'll tell you what, then I'll look back and maybe have some better mea culpas to offer.
Okay, Pablo?
Just grabbing a link. I don't know. That's a great question. As a researcher, there are things I could have researched slightly differently or promoted in a different way. I would just share, I can share a link to a brief we wrote about a different approach to doing the housing element update that we're advocating for as scholars of this topic. I think that, the one, as I mentioned before, I think this idea of a model for affordable housing in low density neighborhoods is super important. I'm working with a group in the Inland Empire trying to get something like that built, a low income home ownership opportunity. There's some people in San Diego. LISC is working on that as well. I don't know, Tara, if you've seen anything in LA County, but I think that, as we create the new city and country that we're going to live in, I think, getting some test cases out there to show people that having a sixplex next to them is fine, and having a low income subsidized sixplex next to them is fine. And once we have those kind of buildings to look at and say, this is what we're talking about, I think that will be a really powerful, much more powerful advocacy tool than people just saying, we need to do this, we need to do this. So I think, working with practitioners more in terms of getting things, experimenting a little bit and getting things built is really important.
Thank you. Tara?
Yeah, and I think, Santa Monica has really historically done a great job of creating policies that have helped further affordable housing production in a market that is extremely challenging to do so. So if anything, I just wish that other cities had become earlier adopters of those same type of policies that we've got here. Having worked in many different parts of the state of California, Santa Monica truly is progressive with these policies. And so I'm really hopeful that other cities will take note, get on the bus, and also that Santa Monica will stay true to its principles and take some of the opportunities now that are coming up with affirmatively furthering fair housing, being more innovative with solutions. So, stay the course, Santa Monica.
Well, thank you all very much. And I'll turn it back over to Natalia.
Thank you so much. I'm going to echo that statement because, sums it up perfectly. Thank you so much to our panelists, Sean, Pavo, and Tara, our moderator, Darlene, and thank you to the committee that plans these events, including Darlene, Kathy Gentili, Barbara Inetsugu, and myself. Well, can't really thank myself, but okay.
We thank you, Natalia.
Yes, you can thank yourself.
I can
Go
thank
right ahead.
Thank you. Well, now I want a donut because of what you said about donut economics. Thank you also to the folks that are watching and listening to this. Thank you for joining us this evening. We really appreciate that you chose to give priority to our panelists this evening over the City Council budget session that's happening, the first meeting of the Public Safety Commission, and all of the other events that are going on right now. So thank you. And if you're watching this on YouTube right now, thank you for watching as well. If you're rewatching, if you're, watching again for the first time, whatever, watch it as many times as you want. There's a lot of information. It might take you a couple times of re-listening to process it all, and that's totally fine. If you're not yet a member of the League of Women Voters, we invite you to join us. And if you're in Santa Monica, you can do that at our website at lwvsantamonica.org/join. Have a great rest of your evening, and we will see you next month. We haven't announced the next one, but once it's there, you'll see it on our website. Thanks again.